Hello, and welcome to the Capital Gains Show. Today is my first debate for this channel. I found a friend on an anarchist chat group, of course, on the internet, and he graciously agreed to be my first debate guest. He goes by StairMasterChef, and you can find his Twitter account at twitter.com/StairMasterChef. Welcome to the program and thanks for joining. Um, I
Thanks for having
think,
me on.
yeah, my pleasure. First, obviously, I'm a capitalist and you're a socialist, and for myself and as well for the audience, I'd like to ask you, can you give me like a rundown of your beliefs in a broad sense, economically and socially, and how you came to your position and just how you feel about what you believe in?
Sure. So my underpinnings on I would consider myself somewhat of a libertarian socialist in a very broad sense. Uh, I'm sure just like there is with right-wing libertarianism, there are going to be many colors of it and
Mm-hmm.
many different ways in which people can disagree or start infighting.
Mm-hmm.
I am very skeptical of the role of the government, but I do see that there is a role in it. Ultimately, I do want something of a workplace democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I do want the means of production to be collectively owned and controlled. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's it. I think people's circumstances should not be determined by just the randomness of their birth.
Mm-hmm.
So I reject the idea of meritocracy, and we can sort of talk about what that is
Mm-hmm.
and what people use the idea of a meritocracy to push for politically.
I got you. Yeah. So, just for the benefit of the audience, I'll clarify where I'm coming from. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I think that most of the time I find myself agreeing a lot with the social aspects of libertarian socialism and most of the non-authoritarian left-wingers. Like most of the people in that camp, I support open borders. I support the equal social rights. I'm pro-abortion. I do believe that Black Lives Matter, and all of those other, kind of bleeding heart social issues. I actually align quite a lot with libertarian socialists. So when we touch upon those issues, I'm suspecting that you and I will probably be on the same page. I think economically, though, is where I diverge a lot, and that would probably be where you and I will find the most disagreement. In terms of, let me give you an example for workplace democracy that you mentioned a moment ago. I
Mm-hmm.
do agree that workplace democracy is acceptable and can be beneficial, but I don't believe it should be mandatory. I believe that private property should be one of several property rights systems that can be morally and justifiably utilized, in an economic sense at least, to help best meet the needs of workers and consumers. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. And I guess if we want to jump into it, I'm interested a lot in your concept of workplace democracy and the way the means of production should be owned. Do you feel like there's any room in your ideology for any form of private property rights, or do you feel more like a collective and worker-owned means of production is something that should just be exclusively allowed, or how do you kind of fall in that regard?
So I have a question, just sort of see how you feel about the idea of democracy in general,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not sure what your position is, but I do find with some anarcho-capitalists that they're not so crazy about the idea of democracy, or at least in the way
Yeah.
that a lot of other people would conceive of it.
That is correct. I am particularly not a fan of democracy on a macro level, on a broad sense. So if you got say a country with 1 million people and 500,001 of them vote for something that has to be mandated across the entire millions of people, that rubs me the wrong way. But democracy, when self-contained within individual workplaces, to me, I see that as a micro democracy framework where there is room for a free market to operate in a broader sense. And then if you've got a lot of little workplace contained micro democracies, I don't really have a problem with that. I do see some value in democracy on a workplace level. I don't want to see it on a grand scale, on a centralized scale. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm very skeptical myself of central planning. I think there is some place for it, and I'm actually, and there are people out here like this, a market socialist for luxury goods. The reason being, one of the things that I think is important politically is the distribution of power. And I don't see the entire economy being controlled by a single entity, right? Whether it's the state or, whatever it is, as a good thing. So I feel like in many senses, the market will be effective at distributing some goods, although, there are certainly market failures that exist
Yeah, I
as
see.
well.
So you see a place for markets, economically speaking, when it comes to luxury goods or goods that aren't necessarily essential, right? But then you would want to see maybe is it correct when I say you would like to see less market activity in essential goods like food, clothing, shelter, that kind of thing?
Yes. So, for example, with healthcare, which is big, it's been a big talking point when it comes to the
Yeah,
recent primaries with the Democratic Party.
sure, sure.
And the way I see it with healthcare is, and I'll talk about my sort of definition of freedom, but I think that somebody should be entitled to healthcare, right? So you can say it's a right if you want to get into like that particular language, but to set a service and say that it's non-excludable, that somebody's ability to have healthcare shouldn't rely on their income or their circumstances or the productivity. To make a commitment to that, I think is important. And I think by doing so, you actually give people more freedom because, in my opinion, if you're a car accident away from going broke, from being in financial ruin, if you're a diagnosis away from being in financial ruin, if you could end up in just complete debt, I don't consider that very voluntary.
Yeah. I know what you mean, and I've heard that argument before. Whereas some libertarians on the right, such as myself, will say, "Oh, real freedom is when you have a lot of negative rights, like the right to pursue whatever, but you don't have any positive rights, like you don't have a positive right to a healthcare service. You just have the right to pursue it unimpeded, right? There's that negative versus positive rights distinction."
Right.
And then I have heard a lot of libertarian socialists say, look, with a few positive rights for essential things that people need to survive and live, then it's okay to make those positive rights, and that can, somehow lead to more freedom than what the right is advocating, right?
Yeah, I would say that, the way I perceive of freedom is because I think right libertarians consider it the absence of interference, right? Negative rights. Whereas I consider it the absence of coercion or domination from somebody else. So if somebody can force your hand into something, whether or not it's the state, right? Whether it's the state or your employer, I don't consider that voluntary.
I see. So when it comes to things like healthcare or housing,
Mhm.
In your ideal society, there would be some means, a safety net of some kind. Whereas when it comes to people with modest means or people with inadequate means or resources, then they would be given those resources to make up the difference, as it were, so that they can get the health care that they need, so that they can get the housing that they need, right? So there would be some kind of
Right.
I don't know if you believe in money existing or not. I guess as a market socialist, maybe you do, but
Yeah.
there would be some kind of outside funding source, right, to feed that type of program that would be giving these products and services to people that need them. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And yeah, I think you can call it something of a UBI, although usually when people think of a UBI, they think of just cash. You
Yeah,
get your $1,000, you're getting bucks.
yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm cool with some sort of safety net of a similar idea, better than Yang's UBI,
Mm,
but whether it's a housing stipend,
mm,
public housing,
mm,
some alternative where when market failures exist, like they do in housing,
mm.
that there'll be something available for those who are on the losing end of that fight for resources.
I got you. So, you don't feel that private charity alone could fill in that gap? Do you feel like private charity would be adequate, or that it wouldn't be reliable enough, or plentiful enough, and that there would have to be some degree of mandatory contribution to these programs so that the resources can be distributed to those who need them?
Yeah, and I think one thing that some people might disagree with me on, obviously, not so much people on my part of the spectrum, but when we say something is a right, we do it because it's something that we want to guarantee.
Yeah.
And when you leave it up to charity, you are leaving up to the whims of other people.
Yes.
So I don't think somebody's ability to eat should be subject to the whims of charity.
Sure.
And not only that, but obviously the way things are now, charity is not picking up all the slack on that. We have, what, 500,000 homeless people in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
We have people who are food insecure and
Mm-hmm.
starving, people marginally housed otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think charity is picking up the slack as is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, private charity, sorry, alone is not currently picking up the slack. Of course, me being a capitalist, I have a lot of explanations as to why I think that is. But what I wanted to touch upon first was the idea of the healthcare or housing as being a positive right in in a world where healthcare is a positive right, and the people of modest means are going to be guaranteed some kind of degree of healthcare being handed out. How do I put it? Do you feel like the contributions to that public healthcare system, where the healthcare is guaranteed, do you feel like the contributions should be made in proportion to how wealthy the contributor is? Like make the rich
Mhm.
people pay more, make the middle class pay less, and so on.
Certainly, as is, absolutely. If we're talking about something that's more ideal to what I think, so something where wealth is distributed better in the first place, where a lot of the gains don't go straight to the top, then I think that's a different sort of conversation. I think I would still think like things to be taxed progressively, by the people who have more means to do so. But certainly, as things are now, I'm absolutely okay with a progressive tax to pay for that. But
Yeah.
also, for when it comes to healthcare in particular, we're already paying a lot of this. I think, a lot of discussion around Medicare for all, or, one of the talking points that comes up is that we're currently paying more actually as a country through private premiums than we would be if we just put everything under a single payer.
That is true. Yes. And yes, I am aware of that. That's absolutely true. Now, in fact, just so you know, I spent a little over a decade. I spent about 15 years in the healthcare industry in an administrative capacity in the insurance world. So I do have a lot of I like to think that I have a lot of familiarity with the healthcare industry. And I'll tell you a few observations that I've seen. A lot of people want the U.S. to emulate a public healthcare system similar to what Canada or the United Kingdom has. And they point to the fact that Canadians and British people are generally spending less per capita for their health care than Americans are. And they also point to the fact that Americans have a lot of healthcare debt, whereas Canadians and British people don't carry healthcare debt, right? Because the government, covers it. And they cite those as advantages. And then they cite also things like, infant mortality and life expectancy as metrics that support the argument that the public healthcare is more effective than the private healthcare, right? So at first glance, it looks like the public healthcare position comes out ahead on all fronts. Oh, it's cheaper and you get better performance, right?
Right.
Well, I disagree with I disagree with the second premise that they have, which is that you get better performance. And when it comes to the when it comes to the first premise that we're spending more, I do concede that Americans do spend more for healthcare, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way in a private care system. And let me tell you something about the healthcare system in America is that right now it's really kind of hybridish because the government covers poor people and the elderly, and then the private market covers just about everyone else. So it's roughly 50-50 when it comes to spending on the healthcare industry in the United States. About half of it is government and about half of it is private care. Well, it just so happens that the more effective dollars spent in the healthcare industry are the dollars that are privately spent. The government, and it's funny because a lot of people say, oh, you'll save money with administrative costs and things like that if it was just a public system, but the government is actually really famous for falling for a lot of fraud and corruption, and it's surprisingly easy for doctors to submit fraudulent claims to the government and they get payouts, whereas in the private sector, they would get caught and the claim would be denied or the doctor would be investigated. I saw a lot of that in the insurance industry when it came to detecting and stopping fraud, and it was remarkable what I saw, how the government was so much more susceptible to fraudulent claims and fraudulent billing than the private market was. But that has to do with incentives because when it comes to the government, they're spending someone else's money, and their performance in the government, when it comes to like public healthcare, your performance is kind of measured by how quickly and how much money you're giving to everybody, right? Because that's your job is to pay out. Whereas when it comes to a private company, your job is to make sure that the dollar is most wisely spent. I'm not saying the private sector always succeeds in making the dollars most wisely spent. I know there's a lot of waste and inefficiencies there, but that generally tends to be the incentive. And the private care market actually gets better results than the public systems do in Canada and the UK. And I'll tell you why. You're not supposed to measure life expectancy when it comes to first world countries because, for example, rich countries tend to be more gluttonous, and as you may be aware, gluttony is bad for your health. So when you're gluttonous, you're more likely to be obese and get heart disease and get cancer and things like that because you're drinking more, you're smoking more, you're eating more, you're doing these riskier activities. But let me tell you where U.S. healthcare shines. U.S. healthcare, the private sector rather, shines when it comes to actual medical procedures. Their survival rates and their success deaths rates. So the U.S. is number one in cancer care survival. They blow away Canada and the UK when it comes to successful cancer operations and procedures, and also when it comes to the amount of time a cancer patient will survive after diagnosis. And, like, for example, the average person in the US might survive 5 or 10 years after cancer diagnosis, whereas in Canada or England, it's only 3 to 7 years. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of that going on. And you'll see similar figures for things like heart disease, trauma care, diabetes care, those kind of things. When it comes to, and there's another big thing that you'll see a lot when it comes to private care is that medical tourism becomes very popular. And the medical tourism usually goes only one way. And the way it goes is the medical tourists come from the places with universal care and they go to the places that have private care facilities so that they can spend out of pocket to get the medical care that wasn't available to them back at home because there was too much rationing, there was too much of a waiting line, So the question is, and of course, medical debt can be a real burden. It's a pain in the butt. That's definitely true. And there's a convenience to not having medical debt in a universal care system. But the way I think of it is, I'd rather be in debt and alive than debt-free and dead from cancer or dead from being on a waiting list. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but there are also, depending on the year, 30, 40, I think as high as 60,000 people in the U.S. who die every year because they can't get adequate medical care.
Yeah.
And to jump over to the medical tourism to the U.S. Yeah, that's true. If you can afford it, then the U.S. is a great country for medical care.
That's true. You got to pay to play generally, right?
Right.
Yeah.
There's a big industry for people coming here so they can cut the lines.
Yeah.
Instead of waiting around.
That's true.
But the way that we recognize care in the U.S. being by your ability to pay, I think is a serious problem.
Yeah, it doesn't seem perfect. It doesn't seem ideal, but from my perspective, I do feel that the private care system generally gets better results and generally treats the majority of customers better. It is true that people that are destitute may be less likely to get the care in the U.S., even though by law, people have to get treated in the USA, even if they don't have the ability to pay. And that's a big part of how medical debt gets accumulated in the first place, because people are getting treatment for things that they cannot afford to pay for. Although it is also true, like you said, that tens of thousands of people in the U.S. defer care or opt not to get care in order to avoid accruing debt. And then they'll die, and that gets racked up to someone dying due to lack of ability to pay for medical care. And that looks really bad. But on the other hand, that was that person's choice, right? They could have chosen to go into debt and get care, and they decided not to, that they didn't want to for whatever reason. In a lot of the cases, those people are already super old and terminally ill anyway, and they don't really want to be kept alive in a hospice. They'd rather just be, given a DNR bracelet, do not resuscitate, right? And let themselves go on. And that's actually what my grandmother did. Rest her soul. She decided to decline further care when she started getting really old and ill, and she wanted to kind of pass away without too much more pain and stress. So she decided to go DNR and forego treatment. Now, her death could be chalked up to one of those 60,000 that didn't get care due to inability to pay, and she did not have the ability to pay. But I think, I was there, and I think that her choice wasn't really so much based on ability to pay as it was based on quality of life, based on love for family, based on, her belief that her life had been fulfilled and that, she was ready to go, as it were. Obviously, that's not the case for everybody. But I think that there's a lot of those kind of choices being made, and then that person dies, and then sometimes that gets interpreted as someone dying for lack of ability to pay, and it looks worse than it really is, you know what I mean, in terms of some kind of condemnation of the private system, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, so even though I think I'm the one who steered this conversation towards healthcare to begin with, I didn't come well prepared with the specific demographics on, the tens of thousands of people who die due to inadequate healthcare.
Yeah, but I remember seeing numbers similar to what you had mentioned before. I mean, It sounds like you're going pretty accurately from memory. Yeah.
Right. But just in terms of, how many of those people are,
Mm.
you know, talking about healthcare at the end of their life,
Yeah.
versus people who say get a
Mm.
diagnosis, and they're waiting on Medicaid to, kick in,
Mm. Yeah.
and they die during that.
Yeah.
Because you can go into the ER if somebody shoots you,
Mm.
and they'll dig it out of you. But if
Sure.
you got something else, something chronic, something that needs ongoing treatment,
Mm.
the ER is just not going to cut it.
Mm.
But I do want to acknowledge too that
Mm.
the way that the U.S. healthcare system currently is,
Mm.
uh, it's not really well designed to work with a free market either, right? Because
Mm.
there's no price transparency, and I
That
know
is
that
true.
some politicians have talked about that. So there are going to be some procedures that may be good enough to pay out of pocket, or to pay a significant amount of with a copayment, something like that. But I think a lot of these large procedures, they can get very, very expensive. I think a disproportionate amount of the healthcare spending does come from older people.
Mm.
But even for
Yeah.
younger people, it can get quite expensive.
Oh
Before
yeah.
Obamacare, a lot of people were,
Oh yeah.
blowing out their lifetime limits,
Yeah.
no problem.
That's absolutely right. I'm agreeing with you more than I even expected when we're going into this, but that's good, right? I'm enjoying it. I'll tell you this. It's definitely true that even young people who are healthy can surprisingly find themselves in an unfortunate accident, and then they're $100,000 in medical debt or something like that, right?
Mhm.
So that absolutely happens. When I was younger, man, I'm an old fart now in my 40s, but back when I was in my 20s, I once broke my ankle. I was insured, but I remember the bills. I went to the hospital. They put a cast on me. I was there maybe they took an X-ray. They put a cast on me. I was there maybe 2 or 3 hours. It was like 10 grand or something, and then I just had the copay or whatever, and then the insurance covered the rest. But I thought the price was outrageous, and I still do, even as
Right.
today with my highly developed ANCAP beliefs. I still think that you're right, that the prices are ridiculous, and the lack of price transparency is a big problem, and a big reason, not the only reason, a big reason for that lack of price transparency is the way the government set up the private care system, and how the healthcare coverage is allowed to be administered, and how it's all coming from employers, right? You got to have a job to get the
Right.
coverage most of the time. I mean, you could buy your own individual plan, but the vast majority of insured people have it through their employer, right? Which
Right.
I think that increases corruption and waste and abuse. I'm guessing you agree with me on that point, right?
Yeah.
But the difference between us here is that I would blame planned economics, I would blame democracy, and I would blame public control of the healthcare industry for that lack of price transparency. But I'm going to assume here, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you would blame the private market and capitalism for that lack of price transparency. Am I right?
I think part of it is just inherent to healthcare, right?
Mm.
Because you break your ankle, you go and you get a scan, a cast.
Yeah.
That conceivably could actually be pretty simple if you really change the system. But something like, I don't know, having ongoing treatment for your kidney, for cancer treatment, for any number of serious illnesses, it doesn't really matter how transparent the pricing is, right? Eventually, it's going to be so expensive so that the only thing that people see are their deductibles, and after that point, they don't really give a damn what the actual price tag is. So it's just
Mm.
difficult to,
Mm.
by the nature of how expensive some of these procedures can be,
Mm.
uh, have it so that people have skin in the game. The consumer rather has
Mm.
their skin in the game, and that they're actually paying attention to how much everything costs.
Mm. Yeah.
Not only that,
Yeah.
but these procedures, for the most part, are not voluntary. You got to get
Yeah.
your appendix out. You got to get your appendix out.
That's true.
Uh,
Most of the time, the healthcare is considered more necessary than elective, right? Probably
right.
75 or 80% of the time. That's true. That's true.
Right, and that's the reason why you've seen, for example, the price for LASIK or whatever it's called,
Yeah,
uh, go down substantially,
that gets
because
cheaper
it's
over
both,
time. Yeah,
yeah, significantly so. But it's
yeah,
different from the rest of the healthcare industry because
yeah.
the pricing is transparent and it's elective.
That's right. And it's
So
less
yeah.
covered by insurance, isn't that correct? I think
Mhm.
LASIK can be, but it's not quite. Usually people are paying out of pocket for LASIK as opposed to having the
Right.
insurance cover it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's something where people actually have the option to choose for it. And if it's too much, and you say, okay, fine, I don't feel like it.
Yeah.
But one of the things with uh, healthcare, with housing, is it the market for it doesn't really change much. There are going to be X amount of people who need it at any given time.
That's right. That's
It's
right.
not going to be like fidget spinners or those scooters, the ones where you don't put your hands on anything. Again,
Yeah.
hoverboards.
Those things are so
Uh,
cool too.
so
Yeah.
the demand for that is not going to change. So I don't think that it works well with market principles.
Speaking of those market principles, I have a question for you. But before I ask you that question, already surprisingly, we're about a half hour into it.
Mm.
I feel like I could talk a bit more if you do as
Yeah,
well. What do you think?
yeah, of course.
Okay, we'll keep going. I want to. I can imagine the way things are going right now that we'll probably have plenty of to talk about for the next half hour. But by the time we get to the 1 hour mark, I'll probably have to end the debate for tonight just because
Sure.
of parental responsibilities. But I'm enjoying it so far. So I wanted
Likewise.
to ask you because you were just talking about that price system, the market system there, and you didn't think it was adequate. But we did. We both, I think, agreed that the LASIK medical procedure has gone down in price. And I think we both credited that, at least in some part, to price transparency. Right? Do
Hmm.
you? I think that if we had more price transparency for the non-elective stuff, like cancer treatments or heart surgery, even those things that aren't elective, I do feel like more price transparency could bring down the cost of those services and make them more efficient, and thus make them more accessible to more people and result in less medical debt. How do you envision a libertarian socialist public system being able to bring that level or even a greater level of downward pressure on the cost of those procedures? How do you feel like it could compete with capitalism when it comes to price transparency and competition and, like I said, putting downward pressure on the prices?
Yeah, I think part of the question itself needs a little bit of examining
Mm,
because uh, to set the goal or to frame the primary goal as reducing the prices.
yeah.
Of course, that would be nice. Sure, the government can print all the money they want, apparently, but
And the socialist
there are
economy
finite,
could print
yeah.
all the labor vouchers they want, right?
I mean, so there are finite resources there, and
Yeah.
I think it is. Uh, any socialist would want an efficient government, but they wouldn't want, or at least I can speak for myself here,
Yeah.
I would want an efficient government, but I wouldn't want one that would, in the sake of that efficiency, a government that would leave people behind.
Mm,
So, in regards to, yes, we probably could reduce the cost if we said, procedures under this amount,
mm,
or, everybody has a $5,000 deductible from the get go, no
mm,
copay, nothing under that. Everything you're out of pocket.
mm.
That's going to leave some people behind. And I don't think that we should be leaving people behind. We know that, the state that some people exist in this economy in
Yeah.
is not very good. There are a lot of people say that study a lot, which I think is kind of, can I cuss on here?
Yeah. You can cuss.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad word, but
Yeah.
the what is it? When people say, "Oh, 60% of Americans
Mm.
don't have $400 to their name."
That's true.
That study, I think, is kind of bullshit. But
Oh, you think it's bullshit? Do you think
Yeah,
that
well,
numbers, that 60% is too high or too low? What do you
I
think?
think the question, if you look at that study in particular, the way it was asked was, do you have this money in your savings or in your account?
Oh,
And I think it was specifically referring to either a checking account, or it was specifically referring to a savings account. But there are other studies where people are asked, can you come up with $1,000, for example, which I think is a better question to ask. And the
mm,
numbers on that are not good either.
mm,
They're really bad.
mm,
And so I think in an economy where a lot of people, particularly the people who are in the lower rung of our economic ladder, are just have so little money to their name,
mm,
to make money a requirement of receiving healthcare
mm,
is immoral to me. That
mm.
will definitely leave people behind who do not deserve to be left behind.
I hear you. So, and it's funny because even though I still disagree on a public healthcare system, I share your sentiment that it doesn't feel fair, it doesn't feel just for people of inadequate means to just not be able to get treatment when they have a heart attack, or get their leg mended when they break it, or
Mm-hmm.
get trauma care if they get assaulted or something like that, right?
Right.
So I definitely sympathize with you on that statement, but I also look at it from the other side, in the sense that, look, we can share that sentiment, and then we can disagree on how to best provide for people. But the fact of the matter is that scarcity that you mentioned before, we can argue about which system will, reduce scarcity the fastest. But the fact is, at least for the time being, scarcity is going to exist whether we have a socialized or a capitalized economy, right? And
I'm not sure if I did. I'm not sure if I agree with that.
oh, you don't. Well,
Um, yeah.
let me clarify then. Let me give an example, right? You could say that scarcity, you may believe that scarcity won't exist if the economy gets socialized, but I'll tell you this, at least right now in the present day, when you look at the United Kingdom or Canada, which have, for the vast majority of their healthcare economies, it is socialized, or at least publicly funded, publicly administered, democratically controlled. It's obviously not perfect socialism. I might even be inclined to agree with you if you say it's not true socialism, right? But it's very far in that direction relative to what the U.S. has. And the fact of the matter is that the NHS and Canada have severe shortages of many kinds of healthcare services and procedures and products. The NHS recently, I mean, there's so many examples I could bring off the top of my head, but one of my favorite ones is that the NHS a couple years ago came under a firestorm of criticism when they decided that in order to better ration the care and get it to the people that need it, they were going to put they put an indefinite surgery ban on fat people and tobacco smokers. So I think that kind of headline brings credence to my contention that scarcity, at least for the time being, is still going to exist to some degree in either system, whichever way, whether we zig or zag. And it's going to take at least a couple generations. Even if socialism works great, it'd probably still take a generation or two to get to the point where you can say, okay, now our healthcare is post-scarcity, at least for now. And even though I don't think socialism could ever get there, for the sake of argument, let's assume it could. I would say still for now, scarcity is a fact of life. So. And even if you don't agree with me on this, right, what I'm getting at, long-winded here. What I'm getting at is that when you have, to your great shock and surprise, you realize that there is some scarcity present in your socialized healthcare system. How do you decide to ration it? You know what I mean? What would be the moral thing? And is it immoral when the reality of scarcity bites into the the plan that and the law that says, oh, we're gonna guarantee it for everyone? You know what I mean? Is it going to be? You're going to have to make a moral judgment. Are you going to say, okay, the fat people are going to be denied care first, or the smokers, or the criminals and the petty thieves, or the racists, or maybe maybe the white man, or maybe the cis men? I'm just coming up with examples here. They don't mean it, but you know what I mean. So what I'm trying to say is how would you deal with or morally justify making those kind of choices if you go so far as to say that healthcare is a positive right? You know what I mean? Do you see the moral kind of dilemma that I'm trying to aim at here?
Yeah. Because I've heard people talk about, for example, if you have a smoker, right? Do they then get last in line when it comes to treatment on their lungs? If we need to do
Yeah.
a lung transplant or whatever.
Yeah, right. Because they'll just smoke away those new lungs, right? So why not just give it to the non-smoker, right?
Yeah. Or there's some, and there's certainly like an element of moral judgment, right? Where, okay, well, this person, they didn't do anything to the lungs. They didn't attack it by smoking cigarettes for 40 years. But, I really don't like playing that game in terms of, I think making commitment to something, we have to go by severity and, not the ability to pay.
Sure.
When it comes to healthcare, and I would like to sort of clarify what I said earlier too. With healthcare, that there is always a time element to it, right? And but when you compare things to, say, the UK, which has been undermining their healthcare, where there have been people talking about privatizing the NHS, and I don't think that's a good example of a society that's made a commitment to provide healthcare to everybody, all of their citizens.
Yeah.
But it is something where, say you zoom out from healthcare, you look at homes, housing. So I know that there are more empty homes than there are homeless people, right? I know that
in America, yes. I don't know about the UK, but yes.
Right. Yeah. In America, I know that worldwide, we produce more food. We produce enough food to actually feed everybody.
Yeah.
But we just have a distribution problem in this. It's not profitable to feed everybody.
Right. That's
so
right.
Then we have, 9 million people die. We have to fact check that. But I think off the top of my head, 9 million people die every year because they cannot eat. I think that's a serious problem. So I think we have to, sort of make it more of a pointed critique towards capitalism. I think when we focus too much on the profit motive, there are circumstances in which the profit motive is good and beneficial, and the incentives are aligned so that everybody gets a good product, right? Everybody gets a good LASIK or a pair of jeans or shoes or whatever. But sometimes, these incentives are not really aligned. People who can afford food will get it instead of people who need food will get it. And we're currently in a situation where we don't really need to make a choice. We don't need to take food out of someone's mouth to give it to somebody else. We can just give them the food.
That's true. I agree with that last part that you said. It does seem to me as well that globally, and especially in America, but also globally, we produce enough food that if distribution were solved, that we would essentially be up on a post-scarcity food supply, at least for the basic nutrients, right? Maybe not for luxury foods. But I think we're pretty much there. Farm yields have never been higher. The amount of the output of farms globally has gone up rapidly just in the past generation, right? And even now, it's gotten to the point in a lot of countries where even poor, jobless people have enough access to food to be fat. Like really fat. There's a show. Have you seen this show, My 600-Pound Life? It's fascinating. There are so many poor, obese people in America and in a lot of other countries. So it feels like we're pretty much there at the post-scarcity threshold for food, right? So why are people still starving and going hungry? Now, you mentioned something a moment ago. You said you complained about the distribution system, and you said that some food was not getting distributed because it wasn't always the case, that it wasn't always profitable to distribute to certain areas, right?
Correct.
When you say that, I had two reactions. My first reaction in my head was, I agree with him. My second reaction was, well, we need to make those distribution routes profitable so that the food will get there, right? But you seem to take the opposite path. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to think that maybe there shouldn't be that as much of a profit motive in food? Do you feel like there's any room for profit in food? And I don't mean like luxury foods. I mean like regular stuff that people need to
Right.
eat.
Yeah, like dropping off rice or something.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know. How does that jive with your philosophy? Because to me, setting up incentives for, say, giving food to a poor country seems something, and I'm not trying to do a gotcha or any, twisting around of words or anything like that.
Sure.
But, to
Don't be
me, that
afraid to
sounds,
criticize.
so, but, to me, this sounds like something that would require a government because the incentives will not naturally align themselves to make that profitable. You can't make it profitable to give people food who can't afford it to begin with.
Yeah. Here's what I see. I think I know what you're getting at. So let me tell you what I see in terms of my idea of a capitalist profitable solution to hunger globally would be, of course, first I'll throw out the obligatory shout out to private charity. It is true that private parties are, I haven't seen the figures on this, but I read something along the lines of that private parties contribute quite a large portion, and I don't know if it's the majority portion, but they contribute quite a large portion of donations for food to get to people that need it, right? So even though governments are well known for donating food and stuff, I know that private charity is very much a big player in that system as well. And I feel like in a world where there's less taxation, less red tape, less regulation, especially regulation related to the food industry and the transportation industries, that we would see the charity dollars become even more effective. And I do believe those charity dollars are already probably more effective than the public dollars as it is, but you would see more mouths get fed per dollar if the market were allowed to strengthen or flourish a little bit more, if the regulations were allowed to be pulled back a little bit more, if the taxes were pulled back a little bit more, especially, you might not like to hear this, especially taxes on the wealthy, because the wealthy people tend to donate the largest sums towards private charity. And the more you're taxed, the less likely, the less inclined you feel like to being generous. You know what I mean? The government already took half my pay. I'm not writing any more checks to any UNICEF. You know what I mean? Like that's the attitude that happens. But when people are not taxed a lot and they've got all this disposable income, then they're more inclined to go, hey man, I want to spread it around. I'm a nice person and I'm going to prove it. I'm going to just totally write a big fat check, and you know what I mean? So I feel like, so, and then aside from private charity though, there are ways to make food distribution profitable in places where it currently is not. Now, from what I've seen right now, the places that are experiencing the most starvation are the places that have the lowest amount of capitalism allowed. Now, I know a lot, I don't know if you believe it's binary, but I know a lot of socialists have approached me that like capitalism, socialism are kind of these binary things. It's like an on-off switch. I feel like capitalism and socialism exist on a spectrum. Like there's like a dimmer switch, and you can be half and half, or you could be 75 and 25. You know what I mean? And there's a lot, and the economies today are for the most part mixed. America's mixed in favor of capitalism and just a little bit of socialism, and then there's a lot of countries out there that are half and half, or maybe mostly socialist and mostly not capitalist. Here's a really good example that I was talking about just very recently with a friend, was that Brazil and Colombia and America and a bunch of other countries tried to donate food and medicine to Venezuela, which Venezuela is being run by a government that declares itself to be socialist, right? And President Maduro refused the aid. He went so far as to weld shipping containers onto a bridge to block the food aid from getting trucked over the bridge across the border into Venezuela. And the thing is that the fact is Venezuela is one of the most hungry countries on the planet right now. 5 million people have fled the country out of a population of like 35 million or something. That's a huge portion of the population there. But the irony is that even when the capitalists try to feed them, the socialists in power said no. You know what I mean? So that makes me feel like if those places that are starving were allowed to have more free markets operate, then you would find it more efficient and easy and less costly to get food transported to those places, and therefore you would be more likely to find a profitable method of feeding those people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still not sure if I entirely agree with that. When it comes to Venezuela, I do agree with your point on the mixed economies thing, and that I know for a fact that's not something that someone would, a lot of socialists, and I'm sure not a lot of capitalists or ANCAPs would agree with, right? The point of mixed economies.
Yeah.
In terms of Venezuela, there are a lot of problems with that. That I think a lot of it does stem from price controls,
Yeah.
which I am very much opposed to on the scale that they did. A lot of it is also resource, what they call it, resource force curse, and
Yeah.
but in terms of control of their economy, uh, the government controls less a percentage of their common economy than France does, right? And no one's talking about France being some socialist hellhole either.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little selective to do the Venezuela thing. Uh, so I did want to touch on that, and I completely forgot what my second point was.
That's okay. But yeah, I hear you about Venezuela there, and I agree with you to some extent. I'm not saying it's true socialism over there, and I'm certainly not saying that Venezuela is trying to realize the type of socialism that you're calling for. Obviously, Venezuela, the government, even though the government may not control as much of the economy as France does, they certainly are pretty heavy-handed when it comes to their policies, especially with price controls, especially when it came to outside interference. And by interference, I mean like outside attempts at donating food, and the French government has a big amount of control on their own economy, but on the other hand, the French government is not nearly as severe when it comes to things like price controls. They do exist in France, but not as much. And as a result, the French culinary industry is still respected, and I think most French people still manage to eat enough calories, right, on the daily. So it's not like France is in need of maybe of public food distribution or a mandatory, food donation kind of administered system or anything like that. But countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe or North Korea or Cuba, those ones are. I remember reading recently that the Cuban government is just recently, asking citizens to make more personal gardens because the Cuban government itself is unable to fulfill the ration coupon booklets, and of course they're blaming the sanctions, and obviously the sanctions don't help. I'm opposed to the sanctions, but frankly, the fact of the matter is that Cuba is an interesting case when it comes to food production because the Cuban soil is very fertile. It's not an arid wasteland. It's not a snow-covered Siberian hellhole. That place has soil that will grow a lot of crops, but Cuban farms are mostly barren. Their fields are fallow, and they produce a mere fraction per acre of produce that a private farm would produce. Let me ask you this though: do you feel like there's any room for private property ownership or in the food production industry, like for ranches and farms and things of that nature? Or do you feel like all of those farms and ranches should be cooperatively owned and democratically administered? Or do you feel like there's room for both? What do you think?
Yeah, so thanks for sort of keeping me on track to go back to what I talked about earlier with democracy. So, and I will answer the question. But
Sure.
my basic idea or my commitment with this is, when it comes to the government. So we decided that in sort of public life like this, if there is going to be a state, then by virtue of being controlled by it, we deserve to be able to participate in it, to understand how it works, right? We shouldn't be subject to the authority of something without any say in it. And
Sure.
I would extend that to the economic realm, where there are, bosses making decisions on the behalf of their employees where the employees have no say. And I don't think that should be the case. So
Mm-hmm.
we've gotten rid of tyrants when it comes to the political field,
Mm-hmm.
and I say that we should do the same when it comes to the economic field.
Sure. So you want to see the workers in control of the decisions that the company makes, in the sense that, I mean, in the sense I and let me back up. You don't want to see a top-down hierarchy of bosses telling and dictating to employees what to do, and what instead you want to see is the means of production, including the food industry, having decisions made by the workers themselves. And I'm assuming you want to see that implemented in a democratic framework, a democratic mechanism, right?
Right. So you can still do it in a democratic framework where there is a hierarchy, right? But
Mm,
the people at the top, the managers,
mm,
for example, are accountable to the people below them,
mm. Yeah.
whereas currently they are not.
Yeah.
They're only accountable to the extent that they keep showing up for work. And even then,
Mm,
they need someone to do the job, but they don't need those people. So they
mm.
can just hire somebody else.
Sure. I think I get what you're going at. Let's imagine, if you will, like a farm with 50 employees, and they don't want to sit there and have to vote on the purchase of every bag of fertilizer, so they'll elect amongst them one manager that's going to be in charge of procurement, and then maybe they'll
Mhm.
elect another manager that's going to be in charge of crop cycling or the harvest, right? And
Right.
then those managers, like you said, would be accountable to the workers, in the sense that the workers could vote to remove them from their positions and have them replaced by someone else, so that holds them accountable, right? That's
Yeah.
what you're getting at.
Yeah, and there are going to be some, there's going to be some stuff that needs to be ironed out, right, to make
Yeah.
sure that all the incentives are
Yeah.
aligned. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, that's the idea.
Sure.
In that, to bring it to a big example that we talked about a lot in 2016, that was a big
Hmm.
talking point. Sorry, I follow too much of this election bullshit.
Yeah.
Everybody was talking about these manufacturing jobs,
Yeah.
right? About them being sent overseas and all of this. The truth is, a lot of them have been automated too, right?
Yes.
Just as many, probably more than have been sent to Mexico or China.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is a consequence of people at the top making decisions
Mm,
that affect the people at the bottom,
mm,
and they don't have any say. The people at the bottom have no say
yeah.
for the choices being made, because I'm not sure these people would vote to send their jobs overseas.
Mm.
And I'm not sure if these
Mhm.
people would vote out, to
Mhm.
be fired and be replaced by a machine,
Sure.
where instead we could be, you know, uh, sharing our productivity.
Yeah.
And when it comes to automation in particular, I think that's a solution to how we approach work. Because I don't think that the way that we approach work, and we could talk about this later,
Mm.
in the US is very healthy. I think there are some good parts about it. I think there are some bad parts about it too.
Mm.
And, for example, if all the workers had some say in automation,
Yeah.
they could still opt in to have some automated machines,
Yeah.
maybe reduce their workload to from 40 to 30 hours a week.
Yeah.
I think that would be a more prosperous society.
Hmm. Hmm. I hear you. I got a couple, or at least one response to that. First, I would like to just clarify. Maybe not all ANCAPs agree with me here, but I think they're wrong on this point, because I'm going to just say right now that I believe that a democratically owned and a democratically operated and worker-owned means of production, business, or what have you, is perfectly compatible with capitalism. Capitalism doesn't forbid collective or cooperative ownership. It doesn't forbid democratic decision making in the workplace. You don't necessarily see very much of it in capitalism, but I
Mhm.
do believe it's allowed. There's nothing
Right.
immoral from a capitalist standpoint about that. It's just not mandatory, right? And here's what, and then, having said that, I want to say that I think there's certain advantages to the things like when you saw the job outsourcing, when you saw the automation, when you see a boss who privately owns a company and has some level of dictation to the employees. Let me touch on those. Let me give you an example. Let's say you've got two companies and they both produce the same kind of widget. One of them is worker owned and democratically controlled. The other one is owned by a group of profit seeking investors, and there's a CEO who dictates all the decisions to the employees, and that CEO answers to the investors, right? Now, let's say that both of these companies are competing with each other in a marketplace, and they're competing for customers, right? So both of them have to be responsive to consumer demand, and both companies are making an earnest effort, an equally sincere effort to produce the best quality product at the lowest possible price. Now, having set up this little example here, let's say that the capitalist company says, I'm going to outsource half of your jobs to China because it's cheaper over there, and then the other half of you guys, I'm going to automate your jobs, right? So now, let's say he just does that to 99% of the staff. So now there's a skeleton crew in America. The rest of the staff has either been automated or the jobs went to China. Then on the other hand, the worker-owned democratically run company takes a look at what that one did, and they say, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be that mean to the workers. We're just going to do 10% automation, and the other 90% of the people, because maybe some new automative tool comes around, they say, we're going to take limited advantage of it, and we're going to keep 90% of our workforce. We're going to keep the pay the same because we care about our workers, right? Then everyone claps and cheers. Hey, yeah, man, those capitalists are stupid. They don't know how to treat the workers. But then here's what happens. The next day, the price of the widgets from the private company goes down by 30%. And the other company, the price of the widget stays the same. Or maybe it goes down by 5% or something like that. And then the automation that was taken advantage of by the capitalist company means that the widgets that the capitalists are producing are of slightly higher quality. There's less inconsistencies in the manufacturing process, let's say. Then what happens is the consumers are the ones that are going to be, because I feel like in a market economy, you need consumer choice. The consumers are going to be the ones that are going to dictate to the companies. The consumers dictate to the CEO of the private company. The consumers dictate to the investors of the private company. And the consumers likewise are ultimately going to be the ones dictating to the democratically controlled worker-owned co-op. And what happens is the sales at the democratically controlled worker co-op fall by half, and their sales revenue goes down 50%. Or let's say the sales revenue goes down by 30% to reflect the difference in price, because the capitalist company had a 30% price reduction. And all of a sudden, the co-op is having trouble making ends meet. Maybe they have to cut pay, or maybe they have to let a couple of people go. While the capitalist company, on the other hand, is expanding production. They're reaping the benefits of the increased revenue, because what happened was one company had an eye towards serving the customer, and the other company had an eye towards serving itself, which ironically enough, and this might sound counterintuitive because you think of capitalists as the greedy ones. Well, what ultimately happened here was the worker co-op ended up being greedier, and the consumers punished that company for it, you see. And that sort of thing can happen in a marketplace. But the end result is, when you look at the big picture, not just these isolated companies, when you look at the population as a whole and the economy as a whole, what ended up happening is, despite a few employees getting laid off, despite a few jobs getting moved to China, what you had was a widget that everyone wants became cheaper and higher quality for everyone. And the reason I say everyone is because everyone who's alive is a consumer, and everyone who is a consumer has access to that widget, and they can choose to buy it if they want. So what you did ultimately was the capitalist company did the more selfless act and benefited society as a whole, where the co-op did not. Anyway, I want your response to that little scenario. I was kind of long-winded there.
So I don't think the framing in that the co-op just served themselves worked, right?
Well, they're workers, right? They're workers collectively, I guess.
Yeah. So they did it in the sense that everybody should be paid a wage with which they could sustain themselves, right? Yeah. And so, in the traditionally owned firm, the capitalist firm, what have they really done? You can say that they serve the consumers, which is true, but they did it at the expense of who? They did it at the expense of
the workers
in China.
They did it at the expense of a minor special interest group, which was just a handful of workers, and they did it for the benefit of the populace as a whole. It was a populist move, is what I'm trying to imply. Yeah,
I think they did it I would frame it as they did it at the expense of an underclass living somewhere else, right, where they don't have the means to you know provide, or they don't have the power to negotiate themselves anything better in terms of pay and living standards.
Hmm.
And so I think
Yeah.
the problem is, or depending on whether or not some people would see this as a problem,
Hmm.
is capital moves a lot faster and a lot wider than people do.
Hmm.
Right. So it
Yeah.
can be very profitable to make those widgets in China, ship them over, and everybody can get their iPhones a little bit cheaper.
Yeah.
But
And the
it's done
cost was a few quality
at,
jobs, I guess, right? The
right,
cost was a
right.
few workers.
Yeah, I mean, not only at the cost of some quality jobs, but at the cost of exploitation of others.
Hmm. I see.
And ultimately, and we haven't talked about this much, but my the goal of my project too, would also be to secure some sort of living standard for everybody.
Hmm.
Uh, I guess you can call me a globalist then, but
Hmm.
I think that, like I said, somebody's living conditions should not be dictated by the circumstances of their birth.
Sure.
And, to exploit an underclass of workers, whether it's in China or India or wherever,
Hmm.
uh, to me seems unethical. And it does center the consumer,
Hmm.
that the consumer gets their cheaper shit, but
Yeah.
at what price?
Yeah.
Because they're not those workers today, but they could be.
That's true. I get a lot of that same argument from a lot of socialists, and I think you put it eloquently. And again, I sympathize with the sentiment, but when I look at that scenario that we just discussed, when I look at it from the big picture, from a global perspective, what I see is ultimately I see more widgets becoming more accessible for more people, and I see the economy as a whole being able to produce more goods and services and meet more consumer demands at the expense of fewer resources, or at the cost rather, or the consumption of fewer resources to achieve it. Do you see that at all with my example, or no?
I don't think it's fewer resources, because I consider labor a resource.
Yeah.
These people are being, criminally, although not literally
Mm-hmm.
criminally, underpaid for their labor.
Hmm.
And so for every dollar that the CEO here who decides to ship over the jobs,
Mm-hmm.
they are getting money that they didn't work for, because
Mm-hmm.
it would not be profitable for them to send those jobs to China, if they couldn't skim off the top,
Yeah.
if they couldn't underpay them for their productivity.
Yeah. Well,
And I think that's a problem.
they're taking. I know what you mean when you say underpay them. What I feel like they're taking advantage of is just arbitrages, price differentials, because the cost of living in China, at least for now, is cheaper than it is in, say, New York City or Miami, right? And then so it seems like from your perspective as an American, you're like, oh my God, they're getting underpaid. From a Chinese nationals perspective, it's like they're saying, "Oh my God, this is the biggest paycheck I ever got," right? And they're excited to do it, and they're begging for more jobs to come from American companies, right? I mean, have you ever been onto Alibaba.com? They're just begging to sell stuff to us, I mean, who wants to exploit Chinese people more, the capitalists in America or the Chinese workers themselves? It seems to me like the latter, because and I'm sure you're going to disagree with what I'm about to say, is exploitation is a two-way street. At least in a free market, exploitation is when both parties in the transaction benefit and end up materially better off, right? That feels counterintuitive, but that's what I see happening. What do you think?
I'm not quite sure if I agree with that. So to bring it more domestic, I suppose, think about Uber, for example. So here in the
Yeah.
U.S., I think the app, or quote unquote the app, uh, what is it? They keep 20% off the top. Do you know what the number is? I
Yeah,
can't remember.
I don't know exactly what the number is, but they do extract a certain percentage of the rider fee. That is true, and the Uber algorithm sets the market rates for what the driver is going to earn on the trip based on a combination of how many drivers are in the area and how much demand there is for rides in the area. Right, so they're using a price mechanism kind of thing that fluctuates, and Uber takes a cut or a tax, if you will, or a fee, a finder's fee maybe might be more appropriate of that off the top
Yeah,
of every ride. That's true.
and it's a two-way thing because there is, good luck finding that many fares without the app to begin with. Right?
Yeah, right.
So that's the infrastructure that people use. So I think that for the people who run the show, who do the marketing, who do the app design, all the engineering, people who figure out the logistics, uh, it makes sense that there would be a percentage taken off the top because yes, those people aren't actually doing the driving, but they're doing the work behind the scenes that makes the driving feasible or the arrangement doable to begin with.
That's right. They're creating an infrastructure that allows the drivers to maximize their efficiency in terms of producing the rides and minimizing their cost of producing rides, because you pick someone up in San Diego, you drop them off in LA, and then Uber says, okay, here's another ride for you right around the block. And you don't have to go driving all the way back to San Diego to get another ride, or you know what I mean? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, in that strict sense, if that was something where only the people actually doing work get paid, right, which is really what I'm proposing as a socialist, that's fine with me. But we could also say, rides would be a lot cheaper if we just set the rates lower, right? We just set the rates 20% lower.
Yeah.
There are people losing on that. And
Yes.
it's possible, of course, to set it so low that it's not even worth it for anybody, right? They wouldn't
That
even
is correct. And
start
that
their
happens.
car.
That
Right.
happens, and I know at least one person who said that they didn't live in a very highly densely populated town, but they said that they tried Uber for a couple months and it didn't really work out for them financially too much. It wasn't worth their time, and they quit. And
Right.
they went and found a different job. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think as it is too, the incentives are in place so that, if you're the guy who calls the shots at Uber, you don't want to pay these people any more than you can get away with to begin with, right?
Sure.
There's really no benefit in that to you.
That's
You
right.
want to maximize, whatever you can get out of it.
And I do that exact same thing whenever I shop on Amazon or eBay.
Right? So, and that makes sense. Like that's very intuitive.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, let's save these people. Again, I don't think they get paid very well to begin with. Is my understanding. If you drive full time, you can put some money together, but a lot of them don't get paid all that well. You could pay them so little so that it's still technically worth it, right? So it's still preferable to getting evicted
Yeah.
or starving,
Yeah.
but it's still not a good arrangement. You can't sustain you can pay them so little so that they can't really sustain any decent quality of life. But that extra money that you save by paying them less, right? That'll go to the top to someone who doesn't have to work for their money. They'll go to investors, to shareholders.
Investors.
And,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And well, obviously, as socialists, I don't find that to be a good arrangement. I think that people should be, there should be some safety net.
Yeah.
But, if people are going to earn an income like that, they should have to work for it. It shouldn't be something where you can just sit on your ass and cash checks. I do know that any business still needs capital to be allocated to it, right? And we still have to make decisions on that. And perhaps it's something we can talk about more in detail.
Yeah.
At a later time. But
Yeah.
I just don't find that arrangement very good. If you just extended to something here at home.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. I would love to have a detailed discussion about the value or lack thereof of investors and what they bring or do not bring to the table, and how necessary or unnecessary they are in an economy. But I think we're out of time here for today. We went a little bit over. We're at almost an hour and 15 minutes. So I'll just let you have the last word on the Uber and the investors. Maybe we can set up a part 2 sometime in the coming weeks if you're open to that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I do appreciate it.
Sure.
I hope that next time, we get to dig in a little bit deeper here.
Sure.
I felt like I derailed things towards healthcare a little bit too much.
I think you did a great job, honestly, and I very much enjoyed our conversation. I thought it was very civil, and I really enjoyed the sincerity. And I also must say that I feel like you have a good grasp of the concepts that you defend, and I also feel like you have a good grasp of capitalism. I don't feel like you strawmanned anything. I feel like you criticized capitalism in good faith, which not a lot of socialists always do. And to be fair, not a lot of capitalists criticize socialism in good faith either. So I hope I gave you good faith arguments, Yeah.
Yeah. One thing
Sure.
I probably should have talked about at the top was, I actually used to be more aligned on. I used to be more of a right winger. I think, if you would ask me some time ago how I would have aligned, I would describe myself as a libertarian, like a right wing libertarian. And I think what really made the difference for me was, and I would like to talk about this too, which I think I've said a lot on this call. Sorry to be repetitive, but
not at all. No.
To talk about the meritocracy, because I think it was my belief in the meritocracy that made capitalism seem like a just system. Like it was a system that sorted people into the right place based on their ability, their smarts, whatever we happen to value at the time.
Yeah.
And there is some degree of that, but there is also a big degree of really just people being put in a position where they can't succeed the way that others can.
A lot of it's luck, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, so the best programmer in the world, right? Or the guy who would have made Jeff Bezos look like he was just farting around on the internet. They could have been born somewhere, right? But they could have also starved to death.
That's true.
We would never know their name.
Yeah.
So that's part of, to wrap it up, that's part of where my politics come from, and that's where my direction towards socialism comes from.
I gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for the parting thoughts. You've given me some things to think about. I hope our viewers have got some things to think about, and I'm hoping I might be lucky enough to have given you a couple of things to think about as well. And what you and I should do, I believe, is talk about finding out when we can do a part 2, maybe continue the conversation and get more into meritocracy and investors and things like that, because I think there's a lot of topics here that we're both passionate about and know something about, and I think we could have some productive discussion.
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to end the recording. I'll get this up on YouTube soon. Everyone on the channel, thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to our discussion. I feel like it was really friendly and informal, but also very informative. Please like and subscribe and tell us your thoughts in the comments below. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What did StairMasterChef get right? What did he get wrong? Are there any topics that you'd like to hear us discuss in a future episode? Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.